You've put real work into your garden, tilling every spring to loosen the soil, fertilizing because your plants need nutrients, spraying when pests show up because you want to protect what you've grown, and your garden still isn't giving you what it should. Here's the part that hurts. It's not that you haven't been working hard enough. It's that everything you've been doing, the tilling, the fertilizer, the spraying, even leaving your beds bare and clean, has been slowly killing the one thing your garden cannot survive without. You've been doing the right things for the wrong soil. Most gardeners don't find this out until they dig up a shovelful of dirt, dump it on a tarp, and count what they find. 3 worms. Maybe 2. In a cubic foot of ground they've been tending for years. That number tells you everything. In this video, I'm going to show you what's actually been happening underground and how to fix it. But before we get into any of that, I want you to know exactly where your garden stands right now. So here's what to do. Dig up a cubic foot of soil from your garden bed. That's roughly 12 inches wide, 12 inches long, 12 inches deep. Dump it on a tarp or a piece of cardboard and count every worm you find. Take your time. Got your number? Here's what it means. Fewer than 5 worms, your soil is in serious trouble. Water can barely get in. Nutrients aren't cycling. Your plants are working 3 times harder than they need to just to stay alive. And no amount of fertilizer is going to fix that. 5 to 10 means the biology is still there, but it's struggling. You caught it at the right time. 15 to 25 worms, that's a thriving underground ecosystem. Your soil is doing real work for you. 25 or more, that's ground that practically feeds itself. The kind of soil where things just grow. Most gardeners who've been doing things the conventional way find somewhere between 0 and 3. Not because they're bad gardeners, because the practices they were taught have been working against the very creatures that make soil alive in the first place. If your number looks different from that, drop it in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. Those creatures are earthworms. And once you understand what they actually do underground, you'll never look at your garden the same way again. But before we talk about how to fix it, you need to understand exactly what's been destroying it, because some of it is going to surprise you. So let's talk about what's actually been happening down there. Earthworms are not just passengers in your soil. They are the engineers. Every tunnel they dig increases how fast water soaks into the ground. Every passage through their body transforms raw organic matter into nutrients your plants can use immediately. One healthy worm population can move tons of soil per acre every single year, loosening it, aerating it, enriching it without you lifting a finger. But here's the problem. Most of what we do in a conventional garden is specifically if accidentally designed to destroy them. And it happens in 4 ways. The first is tilling. Every spring, millions of gardeners fire up the rototiller because loose soil feels like progress. It looks right. It smells right. Fresh turned earth, ready for planting. What you can't see is what's happening below the surface. Every pass of that tiller blade cuts directly through worm bodies. And unlike the old myth, a worm cut in half does not become 2 worms. It becomes 1 dead worm, sometimes 2 dead worms. Research shows that rotary tilling destroys more than 50% of juvenile worms in a single pass. After 5 years of consistent tilling, you can lose up to 70% of your entire worm population. After 25 years, some soils are down to less than 15% of what they started with. But the killing isn't just physical. Every time you till, you're also collapsing months, sometimes years of tunnel networks that worms have built through your soil. Those tunnels are permanent infrastructure. They're how water gets in, how air reaches roots, how nutrients move through the ground. A rototiller destroys all of it in 20 minutes. And then you start from 0 again next spring. The second is synthetic fertilizer. This one surprises people because fertilizer is supposed to feed your garden, and it does for a while. But synthetic nitrogen salts do something else at the same time. They slowly acidify your soil, and earthworms are extraordinarily sensitive to pH. Worms thrive in soil with a pH between 6.5 and 7.5 close to neutral. When pH drops to between 5.5 and 6.5, worm populations fall by around 24%. Drop it further to between 4.5 and 5.5, and you lose up to 68% of your worms. The soil doesn't look different. It doesn't smell different. But underground, it's becoming a place worms can no longer survive. There's also the salt problem. Earthworms breathe through their skin. They need their skin to stay moist to survive. When concentrated chemical salts build up in the soil, they pull moisture directly out of a worm's body through osmosis. Think about what happens when you pour salt on a slug. That's essentially what synthetic fertilizer does to earthworms over time, slowly, invisibly, season after season. The third is pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides. Even products that aren't designed to kill worms often do exactly that as collateral damage. Fungicides wipe out the microbial communities that worms depend on to digest their food. Without those microbes, worms can't process what they eat, and a garden full of organic matter becomes useless to them. Herbicides remove the surface vegetation and leaf litter that worms feed on and shelter under. And certain common insecticides are devastating at field application rates. Some studies have documented worm population crashes of 45 to 96% within just 28 days of a single application. The hard truth is that when you spray to protect your garden, you are often dismantling the biological system that protects it naturally. The fourth is bare soil. This one is easy to overlook because bare soil looks tidy. Clean beds, no weeds, everything in order. But for earthworms, bare soil in summer is a death sentence. Earthworms are cold-blooded. Their bodies are roughly 80% water. They breathe through moisture on their skin. When the surface of unprotected soil heats up under direct sun, and it can easily reach temperatures above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, on a hot afternoon worms have two choices: go deep or die. Most retreat below the root zone where temperatures are tolerable, which means they're no longer doing any work near your plants. And between waterings, bare soil dries out so fast that even the top few inches become uninhabitable. Dry soil is the equivalent of suffocation for an earthworm. They don't need floods, they just need consistent moisture near the surface. Without it, they leave, or they don't survive long enough to matter. Here's what makes all four of these so difficult to recognize. Every single one of them feels like good gardening. Tilling feels productive. Fertilizing feels responsible. Spraying feels protective. Clean, bare beds feel organized. The intentions are right. The results are the opposite of what you're going for. But now that you know what's actually happening, let's talk about how to fix it. And the fix looks different depending on what kind of soil you're starting with. Even if your soil type isn't the first one I mention, don't skip ahead. The mistake people make with clay is often the exact opposite of the mistake people make with sand. Knowing both helps you understand your own soil better. Because one of the biggest frustrations I hear from gardeners is this: they watched a video, followed the advice exactly, and still didn't get results. And 9 times out of 10, the reason isn't that the advice was wrong. It's that the advice was written for a different kind of soil than the one they have. So before we talk about what to do, we need to talk about what you're working with. There are 4 situations that require a different approach: heavy clay, sandy soil, cold climates with hard winters, and ground that floods or stays wet for part of the year. Figure out which one sounds like your garden and pay close attention to that section. If you have heavy clay soil, you know who you are. When it rains, it grabs your boots like wet cement and doesn't let go. When it dries, it splits open in slabs like the bottom of a dried-up lake. Water sits on the surface after rain instead of soaking in, and every time you try to dig, it feels like you're working against the earth instead of with it. Here's the good news about clay. It's not as hopeless as it feels. Clay soil actually holds more nutrients and organic matter than almost any other soil type. The problem isn't what's in it, it's the structure, and that's exactly what earthworms fix. The worm species best suited to heavy clay are the deep burrowers nightcrawlers. These are large, powerful worms that can drill vertical tunnels straight down through compacted clay, sometimes 3 feet deep or more. Those tunnels become permanent drainage channels. Research shows that in a no-till system with a healthy nightcrawler population, water infiltration rates in clay soil can increase anywhere from 6 to 43 times compared to conventionally tilled ground. That's not a small improvement. That's the difference between a garden that floods and one that drains. The key with clay is this: stop tilling entirely and start adding organic matter to the surface, not mixed in on top. A thick layer of compost, shredded leaves, or wood chips sitting on the surface gives worms something to eat as they come up to feed at night. They pull it down into their tunnels naturally, incorporating it into the clay below without you ever touching the soil structure. Aim to keep your organic matter levels between 4 and 5%. That's the sweet spot for worm activity in clay, enough to feed them and improve structure, without creating waterlogged pockets that can actually push them out. And whatever you do, don't till in the spring because the clay feels hard. That hardness is temporary. Give the worms one full season of undisturbed ground and a consistent layer of surface mulch, and you will feel the difference when you push a finger into the soil by fall. If you have sandy soil is the opposite problem. Pour a full watering can on it and the surface is dry again in 20 minutes, like watering a sidewalk. Nothing holds, nothing stays. Nutrients wash out before roots can reach them. In summer, it heats up fast, sometimes dangerously fast, for the worms you're trying to attract. And because it's so loose and abrasive, it can actually damage the thin, moisture-dependent skin that worms breathe through. The single most important thing you can do for sandy soil is build up organic matter. When organic matter, particularly the dark, stable kind called humus, reaches between 4 and 5% in sandy soil, something remarkable happens. That soil can suddenly hold 10 times more water than it could before. Not slightly more, 10 times more. The physical character of the ground changes completely. To get there, add compost generously and repeatedly. 3 to 4 inches worked into the top layer to start, then at least 2 inches every year after that. And cover the surface always. A layer of mulch over sandy soil does 2 critical things at once. It keeps moisture from evaporating before worms can reach it, and it keeps surface temperatures low enough for worms to work near the top where your plants actually need them. Once worms establish in amended sandy soil, they take over from there. Their castings bind loose sand particles together into stable clusters that hold water and nutrients, far better than raw sand ever could. They also leave a thin biological film on the surface of the soil that reduces evaporation by up to 20% on its own. The worms essentially start repairing the soil's water-holding ability from the inside out. If you garden in a cold climate Canada, the northern states, anywhere with hard freezes, the worms in most northern gardens are European species that arrived with early settlers. They've adapted well enough to survive, and here's how you help them do it. When soil temperatures drop below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, worms slow down significantly. They're not dead, they're conserving energy. Most species burrow below the frost line before winter hits, curl into a tight knot in a small chamber lined with mucus, and wait. Their eggs, called cocoons, are even more cold-hardy. Worm cocoons can survive temperatures as low as -35 degrees Fahrenheit. So even in a brutal winter, the next generation is protected underground. Your job in cold climates is to protect the zone where worms overwinter and where their cocoons sit. The most effective way to do that is to apply a thick layer of mulch 8 to 10 inches before the ground freezes. That layer acts as insulation, keeping the soil beneath it warmer than the air above, and giving worms a buffer zone where they can stay active longer into fall and wake up earlier in spring. One note: don't move garden worms into nearby natural forests. In forests that evolved without earthworms, they can cause real damage. Keep them in your garden where they belong. If your soil floods or stays wet for part of the year, this is the situation that confuses people the most, because the assumption is that worms drown. They don't, not exactly. Earthworms don't have lungs. They breathe through moisture on their skin, which means they can actually survive submerged in water for weeks or even months, as long as the water contains enough dissolved oxygen. The real danger isn't the water. It's what happens to the oxygen in waterlogged soil. When soil is completely saturated for extended periods, the microbial activity underground consumes available oxygen faster than it can be replaced. The soil turns anaerobic oxygen depleted, and that's when worms suffocate. Large night crawlers can die within 36 hours in truly anaerobic conditions. Some worm species handle wet conditions far better than others, and will naturally colonize flood-prone soil over time if you give them the right conditions. The most important thing you can do in seasonally wet soil is avoid adding fresh organic matter, raw manure, kitchen scraps, green plant material right before a flooding period. Fresh organic matter accelerates microbial activity, which burns through oxygen even faster and can suffocate your worm population before the water even recedes. Focus instead on raised areas. Even a gentle mound of improved soil 8 to 10 inches above the lowest point of your garden gives worms somewhere to retreat when water rises. They'll move there on their own and move back into the lower areas when conditions improve. Now that you know what your soil is working against and what your worms actually need, let's talk about the specific steps to bring them back. Because the method is simpler than most people expect, and it starts with something you've probably been throwing in the recycling bin. The method itself is simple. 4 steps, done in order. You don't need to buy anything special. You don't need to start over. You just need to change what's happening on the surface and let the worms do the rest underground. Step 1. The cardboard layer. Take plain brown corrugated cardboard shipping boxes. Moving boxes and lay it flat directly on your soil. Remove all tape, staples, and glossy labels first. Overlap the edges by at least 4 to 6 inches so nothing grows through the seams. Then soak it thoroughly until it's completely saturated and heavy. This does two things at once. It blocks all light from reaching the soil, which kills existing weeds without any chemicals. And as it begins to decompose, it releases chemical signals that worms can detect from 20 to 30 feet away. They move toward it. That's why it works. One thing to check: before you use any cardboard, drop a small amount of cooking oil on the surface. If the oil beads up and sits on top, that cardboard has a chemical coating. Toss it. If the oil spreads and soaks into the fiber, it's safe. Plain brown shipping cardboard is what you want. Avoid pizza boxes, cereal boxes, or anything with a shiny coating. Step 2. The mulch layer. On top of the cardboard, spread a thick layer of organic mulch. Shredded leaves, wood chips, straw, any combination works. Aim for 4 to 6 inches in summer, 8 to 10 inches going into winter. This layer does what a forest floor does naturally. It keeps soil cool in summer, warmer in winter, and holds moisture like a sponge. As it breaks down, it feeds the worm population from above. The worms eat from the bottom of the mulch layer, pull decomposing material down into their tunnels, and fresh mulch settles in from the top to replace what they've consumed. It's a self-replenishing system. One important warning about straw: commercially grown straw can carry herbicide residues, particularly a chemical called aminopyrrolide that survive composting, pass through livestock intact, and remain active in soil for years. At tiny concentrations, it causes tomatoes, beans, and potatoes to twist and fail to produce. Before using any straw, do a simple test. Mix it 50-50 with clean potting soil in a small pot. Plant a few pea or tomato seeds. Set up a control pot with just clean soil. Watch for 2 to 3 weeks. Straight leaves and normal growth, the straw is clean. Cupped leaves, twisted stems, stunted growth, don't use it. The safest alternatives are wood chips from a local tree trimming service, often free for the asking, shredded autumn leaves, or pea straw. Pea plants are so sensitive to pyrrolide herbicides that farmers never spray them on legume fields. If pea plants grew there, the field was never treated. The straw is safe. Step 3. The feeding stations. Every week or two, lift a corner of the mulch and tuck a small amount of organic material directly onto the cardboard. Replace the mulch on top. Worms find these deposits within days and concentrate their activity exactly where you place them. But what you feed matters, and how much matters just as much as what. Coffee grounds. Worms are genuinely attracted to them, but too much caffeine harms them. Use a light sprinkle regularly, not a thick layer all at once. Chicken manure. Fresh chicken manure releases ammonia that burns worm skin. Compost it for 6 to 9 months first, until the sharp smell is completely gone. Then it's safe to use. Fresh grass clippings. Pile them thick and they mat together, trap heat, and turn anaerobic worms will flee or die. Dry them first, apply in thin layers, and never use clippings from a lawn recently treated with herbicide. What to keep out entirely. Meat, dairy, and oily scraps attract rodents. Citrus peels and onions in large quantities repel worms, and any plant material treated with herbicides will work against everything you're building. Step 4. Stop disturbing the soil. This is the hardest step because it goes against what most of us were taught. Put the tiller away. For good. Worms are building a tunnel network beneath your garden that functions as permanent infrastructure. Drainage channels, air shafts, nutrient highways running from the surface down to the subsoil. Every year you leave it undisturbed, that system grows more complex and more effective. Research shows that after 5 years of no-till, worm density increases by an average of 137% compared to conventionally tilled ground. Till once, and you set it back to zero. If you need to plant, push the mulch aside, cut a small hole in the cardboard, and plant directly into the soil below. The worms will have already loosened and enriched that ground. Push the mulch back around the base of the plant when you're done. And when summer crops finish, don't leave the bed bare over winter. Plant a cover crop: winter rye, crimson clover, oats, and peas. Their roots release sugars into the soil that feed the microbial communities worms depend on through the cold months. Come spring, Cut the cover crop at the base, lay it flat as a fresh mulch layer, and plant directly through it. The worms pull it underground and convert it to castings. The cycle continues on its own. Now let's talk about what to expect, because this is where most people either stay patient or give up too soon. The timeline depends on your starting conditions, your climate, and how much organic matter you're adding. But here's what a typical first year looks like. Weeks 2 to 4. Lift the cardboard on a damp morning and look underneath. You'll start seeing worms gathering there, maybe just a handful at first. Don't be discouraged by the small number. These are scouts. They've detected the decomposing cellulose and moved in from the surrounding soil. The population builds quickly once the first ones arrive. Months 2 and 3. The soil beneath the cardboard will be noticeably darker than when you started. That darkening isn't cosmetic, it's organic matter being pulled into the soil profile by worm activity. You'll also notice the texture changing. Ground that once resisted a shovel will start to give way when you push a finger into it. And pay attention to the smell. Dead soil smells like nothing, or sometimes faintly metallic. Living soil has a rich, clean, earthy scent. That smell has a name, geosmin. It's produced by beneficial bacteria that only thrive in a functioning soil ecosystem. If you can smell it, the biology is working. Months 4 to 6. The cardboard itself will be mostly gone, consumed by worms, and broken down by fungi until only traces remain. Look closely at the surface of your mulch. You'll start seeing small, dark, granular mounds scattered across it. Those are worm castings, and they tell you something important. Castings on the surface mean nightcrawlers have established permanent vertical tunnels beneath your garden. They're not visiting, they live there now. Those castings contain 5 times more nitrogen than the surrounding soil, 7 times more phosphorus, and 11 times more potassium, all in forms that plant roots can absorb immediately. No bag of fertilizer comes close. By the end of the first year, go back to that cubic foot test you did at the beginning. Dig it up, dump it on a tarp, and count again. If you followed the 4 steps consistently, that number will look very different from where you started. And unlike fertilizer, which stops working the moment you stop buying it, this system regenerates itself. The worms breed, lay cocoons in the soil, and expand their territory on their own. As long as you keep feeding the system with mulch and keep your tools out of the ground, the population keeps growing, and the soil keeps improving season after season, for free. But before we finish, there's one more thing worth knowing. Something you're going to come across if you dig deeper into this topic. And if you're not prepared for it, it can throw everything we've just covered into doubt. Some people will tell you that earthworms in North America are invasive species and shouldn't be encouraged. And there's a kernel of truth in that, but it's being applied to the wrong context. Here's the truth. In certain old-growth forests of Canada and the northern U.S. that evolved without earthworms, common worm species can damage the leaf litter layer those ecosystems depend on. In those environments, they cause real harm. But your vegetable garden is not a forest. It's already a managed environment. In your garden beds and raised beds, earthworms are not a problem. They are the solution. The one worm you do want to avoid is the Asian jumping worm Amynthas species. These are increasingly common in the eastern United States and are genuinely destructive even in garden settings. They consume organic matter far faster than native species, leave soil with a texture like dry coffee grounds, and collapse the aggregate structure that healthy soil depends on. You can identify them easily. When disturbed, they thrash violently and move like a snake, nothing like the slow, steady movement of a common earthworm. Their castings look like loose, granular soil rather than the smooth, rounded mounds left by beneficial species. If you see them, remove them. Don't compost them. Don't move them to another part of the garden. Everything else? Welcome them, protect them, and get out of their way. Here's where we land. Your garden doesn't need more products. It doesn't need more intervention. It needs less of what's been driving the biology out of it and more of what gives that biology a reason to come back. 4 steps: cardboard, mulch, feeding, and the discipline to stop tilling. That's the whole method. This week, I want you to do 3 things. Go outside and do the cubic foot test. Write down the number you find. That's your baseline, and it's the only number that matters right now. Then start collecting cardboard. Plain brown shipping boxes. Do the oil test on anything you're unsure about. Stack it somewhere dry until you're ready. And if you have straw already sitting in your garage, run the bioassay with a pot of peas before you spread it anywhere. 3 weeks of testing can save an entire growing season. You don't need to do everything at once. You don't need to overhaul your whole garden in a weekend. Start with one bed. Do it right. Watch what happens over the next few months. The worms will show up. They always do when the conditions are right. You just have to stop getting in their way. And once they do, your garden will never be the same. If this video helped you see your soil differently, leave a comment below and tell me what your worm count was when you did the test. I read every one. And if you know someone who's been struggling with their garden for years, send this to them. Sometimes, all it takes is understanding what's actually happening underground. Thanks for watching. Now go check your soil.